And I better plug in my computer because it's starting to lose battery again. So what you're going to have to do, Skip, is probably stay as far away from the mic as possible. Talk loud, but don't talk too loud or it's going to echo and it's going to sound like you're in the Grand Canyon.
Okay.
That's perfect. Don't do anything. Because you were pretty much laying back the last time you were on. You were laying back in there and eating dinner and all that stuff. And it's like, what, you don't need to be like right up at the mic going, "Hi, I'm Skip and I'm famous," or something. But okay, for everybody who wants to know what we're doing, this is the second part because the first part was a disaster. And I don't know what it is about these things because Skip and Adam are like friends, I guess, unless they hate each other now. Right?
Yeah, it's maybe it's an Illinois-Iowa thing. Like maybe our states are like are kind of like fighting each other over internet sharing.
Yeah. Okay, now I gotta do something because your audio is getting echoey again. But let me fix that. Let's see. Come on. No, I don't want a webcam. Stop. I want my web. Okay, wait a minute.
It's weird because I use Google Hangouts to do most screen shows without issue. So
let's see. I'm gonna try something. No, that's not gonna. You'd think it would do something, but oh well. We're gonna have to live with it. This is how it's gonna be. So bear with us. It's gonna be very echoey. Just talk. It's almost like what you need to do is take the laptop. I assume this is on the laptop. Put the laptop clear across the room and start talking. Because isn't the Skype thing on your desktop?
No, I'm Skyping through my laptop too.
Okay, that might be the problem.
I can try going in Skype through desktop. Let me try it.
Try to do the Hangout through the desktop next. We're going to try everything. But anyway, we're going to talk about the Plainfield tornado, which seems like it's been 26 years ago now, the rate this is going. And I saw this today, and while we continue to work on this, since it's still a bit echoey, but at least Skip, I can hear Skip, Skip can hear me, and we can at least hear each other, even though it's a bit echoey. I saw something today, because I saw the article from WLS in Chicago about what if the Plainfield tornado happened today? Well, of course, it would actually be warned on, like it was not in 1990, as it thunders outside at my house. What do you know? It's doing all sorts of stuff outside. And I looked at this, and it's not surprising because Skip, you would know, and especially Adam, who is a chaser, who's been on this program before, who lives in Chicago, that the population of the suburbs has really exponentially increased since 1990.
Right.
So, and I looked it up. Plainfield at the time of the tornado only had 4,500 people living in it. Today, the estimate is 41,000. So, of course, with warnings, because the weather service in Chicago is a lot better than it was 25 years ago, because we'll discuss that, because that would have been half the problem of the Plainfield tornado. It was not warned on until, unfortunately, after the tornado had already touched down and had already been on the ground, and I think it had lifted when they issued the tornado warning. But I'm thinking if the same thing had happened today, places that were pretty much farm fields in 1990 are now subdivisions. So the damage would be much worse. Would there have been the same death toll? Probably not. There'd be a lot more injuries. There was only 350 plus injuries in the 1990 tornado, and a hypothetical 2015 tornado would probably injure at least 1,000. Even if it's minor, it would injure more people. But
that's a difficult. It's kind of a difficult estimate to make. There's a lot of variables there that you have to think about. One of the things to keep in mind is that most of the residents in Plainfield have basements. Most of the houses built up in the Chicago suburbs do have basements. So we find that when tornadoes do strike and there's a timely warning and everybody knows about it and it gets a chance to get down to that basement, the deaths and injuries are actually fairly minor. There's not too many. Whereas, say, a more Oklahoma event where virtually no one has a basement, we find there are a lot more injuries. There are a lot more deaths. Something like a Joplin, for example. Joplin, again, has kind of that southern mentality where they don't build basements, and that tornado was difficult to see, and it wasn't warned well in advance, so we had a huge death toll on that. I think the upper Midwest gets spared a little bit from that just because we have a lot more basements to work with. But traffic is going to be another problem because I think you would see a lot of injuries from a tornado like Plainfield or something similar tracking to that area along. There's a lot of interstates in the area with I-80 and I-55. The junction between those interstates is right near Plainfield. So we'd probably see some deaths and injuries from the rush hour traffic that would be impacted too.
Oh, and by the way, your audio is coming through the Hangout now.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
So we can kill Skype.
I hate to say it, but if we did, let's see what happens. If it does, call me back.
Okay.
Yay, it's working.
Good.
It's working. Now see if it's still echoing. So test, test, test.
No, it sounds pretty good.
Yes. I knew Skype would do something right. Okay, so keep going. But I'll discuss this because I'm sure you did some study. You're all about studies, watching old ghost trains. If you want to watch those, go watch them because they went into old tornado outbreaks. And if I had known when they were on, I would have started complaining because, and I remember there was the episode, and I'm going off topic. There was a thing, the Heston Day that you did back on I think it was a beta test episode of Ghost Train, the March 13th event. And you're all like about Kansas and Oklahoma, and you disregard the Iowa tornadoes. And that made me mad. And then you're like, oh, let's look at the videos of all the tornadoes on that day. And I'm like, you missed one. Port Byron, Illinois was the same day. And that was the guy who went out to his backyard, took a video of the tornado, and then he runs down to the basement, and then his house gets destroyed by the tornado.
Yeah, I've seen these videos. Yeah, there's kind of that disconnect with the other tornadoes that happen in an event. Sometimes you kind of forget about the other ones.
And then the one that really grabbed me was, because I live in the eastern part of Iowa, in Jones County, which is east of Cedar Rapids. And if you noticed on that day, there was an F4 tornado. That was 10 miles from my house.
Wow.
Where I was living. But the only thing it hit, it did hit a town. It hit Worthington, west of Dubuque. It was weakening. It had gotten skinny. It was a real skinny tornado at the time, so it damaged the town. The interesting thing is I had never seen a picture of that tornado until this year when they finally had pictures of it. And it was a wedge tornado. It wasn't like a wedge, but it was fairly big.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I have never seen that tornado before. And it's like so nice. I only remember that day. And I'm going off topic because it's almost similar to Plainfield, because Plainfield was hot, humid, and a tiny little cold front came in. But March 13th was different. But it was hot. I could see the clouds billowing up. And of course, they issued a tornado warning. Back then, as in the case with Plainfield, they issued tornado warnings for whole counties. Well, why the heck for? They issued the tornado warning for my county. It was sunny outside. The only thing you knew that something was going on is you looked straight north and all you saw was this big cauliflower cloud expanding the whole northern horizon, and that's what it was.
Yeah.
But unlike Plainfield, which we're going to talk about now since we have our audio working, is a storm. It wasn't really a, quote, an event. It just seemingly was a few tornadoes. It wasn't a whole big event.
No, it wasn't a large-scale outbreak. There was only one significant tornado with that event, and I think that's kind of how those events unfold. Plainfield was a special case. Plainfield was an extreme instability, poor directional shear northwest flow event. That kind of setup generally favors more of a derecho, an MCS type event. It's not a big tornado producer. but still the potential is there, obviously, for a violent tornado under those kinds of conditions.
And most people, when you look at tornadoes, these big honking tornadoes, they tend to go southwest to northeast.
Right.
But most people don't, and you think that April 27th and let's say like Bridge Creek this year, or all these tornadoes southwest to northeast. What most people don't think of, especially up here in the Midwest, is in the summertime, most of the tornadoes come from northwest to southeast, because most of the frontal systems, you get these Canadian fronts that come in and it just cools temperatures down by 10 or so degrees, and they're not strong. And this Plainfield one was a northwest to southeast tornado.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing about Plainfield. We have what's known as northwest flow. Basically, your jet stream winds are coming out of the northwest in the summertime in the Midwest, rather than in the out of the southwest, where your jet winds are coming from in the springtime. So your more conventional springtime tornadoes are typically moving to the northeast, just because we have that southwest flow aloft. But late in the summer, we usually have northwest flow aloft, and that's going to basically steer your storm and tornado from northwest to southeast, which is what happened with Plainfield.
Now, there was with that storm, it had been producing pretty active weather before that.
Right.
It had produced a tornado earlier. It was very weak. But that, and we'll get into the Weather Service, because the Weather Service, we could go on about that for a whole show, because the Weather Service, I would say, did not do a good job with that, because there was a tornado, I think it was south of Rockford or west of Rockford, and the storm just kept moseying down to the southeast. And there are, if the Weather Service in Chicago has pretty raunchy, I'd call it raunchy, radar things where it's almost like a pencil, and whatnot, and the storm just kind of moves along, and it has a hook echo. And the first, when it was starting to develop the Plainfield tornado, and they didn't see it and issue a tornado warning. And that just seems unfathomable, except for the fact it was not Doppler radar. They were still using the WSR, I think 74 or 57, whichever was that.
Yeah. So here's the thing about the Weather Service, and kind of backing up and starting from the beginning here. With this event, the forecaster's looking at this event, and they're trying to determine what the potential for tornadoes is. So on August 28, 1990, they're looking at the upper air charts, they're looking at the surface observations, and what they're seeing is an environment that's not favorable for tornadoes. We have a weak westerlies at the surface, maybe 5 knots. Our 500 millibar winds midway up the atmosphere, about 30 knots, 30, 35 knots, not particularly impressive. This is very, very common for summertime. This is weak, what we call a weak shear, weak directional shear. On the other hand, what we did have an absolute excess of was moisture and instability. So our dew point temperatures were hitting 80, and the surface temps were about 90. And we had cold air aloft because of this cold front and system pushing in from Canada. And so our CAPE values were actually astronomically high. We had CAPE in excess of 8,000. So we had this weird environment where we had absolutely incredible instability. 8,000 CAPE, you just don't see that too often. That's extreme. And we had very weak directional shear. So this is a weird environment. It's not something that favors a tornado outbreak or tornadoes in general. Typically, you like to have a nice mix of CAPE and directional shear. But something unusual happens in these environments. When you have that much CAPE, when you have that much instability, basically all bets are off on what's going to happen. Basically anything can happen. You can have a violent tornado, you can have a derecho, you can have a cap bust, you can have just kind of a ho-hum rainy day. Basically, all bets are off. Anything can happen. So, and they didn't know that back then. This was an exceptional event back in 1990. Forecasters didn't have too many case studies to go off of that were kind of parallel to that. In fact, if you look at charts of tornadoes, Plainfield is still a big outlier, 8,000 CAPE with very minimal SRH. That little point on the scatter plots they do of SRH and Cape tornadoes. It's way out there on the edge. So it's an unusual event. As a result, just based on the forecast knowledge that they had, they didn't think it was going to be a big tornado event. They reviewed the event afterwards and said, where did we go wrong? And they said, well, we went by the books. Everything we know basically says that this should not have been a big tornado event. And as a result, the tornado probabilities were low that day. They did not issue a tornado watch. They did see the extreme instability and potential for thunderstorms, so they issued a severe thunderstorm watch, which by the books was the correct move to make. Yeah. So they're expecting damaging winds, they're expecting hail, they're not expecting a big tornado event. And then you have the Chicago office, which is watching this unfold. So they're starting from this mindset that it's not going to be a big tornado event. We're going to focus on MCS, potentially a derecho type play here. And they are using antiquated radar technology. They're using the WSR 57, I believe, which is a 19
sales.
Yeah, it's a very old radar. It doesn't have Doppler. It's poor resolution. So they're not getting a very clear picture of what's happening here. That was a problem. They're not expecting a big tornado event, and then they're also not getting good spotter reports because no one could see this tornado. It's very heavily rain wrapped, very HP. So what happens was the storm did go up. It went up by Rockford early in the afternoon, and we were getting severe winds, severe hail, some wall cloud type activity out of the storm. There were a couple of brief or weak tornadoes before Plainfield, but I think you just had the right mix of conditions where you can have an F5 strike a populated area and it's not warned. So what happened ultimately was an F5 tornado hit a populated area in a severe thunderstorm watch with no tornado warning. So these people had no warning when the F5 hit. We had 29 deaths. It could have been much worse. You're talking about an F5 with no warning. That the potential when that happens is for there to be hundreds or even thousands of deaths, depending on where it hits. So it's fortunate there weren't more deaths. And I don't fault the Weather Service too much for this event because it was an exceptional event and they really didn't have the tools or the knowledge at the time to really handle that situation well. So yeah, they could have done it better. They could have been more vigilant. They could have been on their guard. You can pick out the hook echo on the radar. It is an unusual looking storm on the radar. The mesocyclone and tornado actually formed on the southeast flank of the storm, basically on the leading edge of the supercell. You typically don't see that. Usually it's on the southwest flank of the storm. But again, we're talking about a northwest flow event, and you have that northwest shear vector. You often get mesocyclone propagation on the leading edge, the southeast edge, which is unusual. But again, in the knowledge at the time and the forecast tools, I don't think they would have really seen that coming or been too on top of that. But so yeah, that event, of course, sparked this whole where do we go wrong, what can we do better, and they've made tremendous gains since then. We have new radar technology. We now have not only Doppler radar, but we have now all the dual pole products. There have been case studies of Plainfield. There have been several other case studies of similar events have happened since then. The Roanoke F4 in Illinois in 2004 was analogous to Plainfield. And they're much better prepared now. So would that happen again? I don't think so. I think we would definitely have the warning out and people would be much better prepared for it. But yeah, at the time, it was just this issue of not having the proper tools and the right knowledge.
And the problem they had, and now I can hear myself, so you're going to have to mute yourself while I talk.
Okay.
I can hear myself. And hopefully when you unmute, it's going to be better. But what I know is that now I just lost train of thought. Okay, yeah, now I remember. From the Weather Service, back then, the Weather Service in Chicago wasn't just where the Weather Service in Chicago is now. And I think that was part of the problem. If they were just concentrated on the area that they cover now, I think they would have probably done a lot better than them covering the northern half of Illinois like they used to. And that was what led up to, well, the Weather Service in, let's say, the Quad Cities or Lincoln can start doing their own forecast, because they weren't at the time. The Weather Service in Chicago was doing it. So Chicago was being overworked, and they had virtually about the same staff they do now. And that's not fair to people who don't live in Chicago. That back then they were kind of like, well, we only care about Chicago, we don't care about you other people. Well, they do, but that was half the problem. It's this, what they would call the playing field syndrome, which I have heard numerous times, where stuff like this happens, even if it's an anomalous event, like an F5 tornado hitting with no warning. There was a severe thunderstorm warning, but back then they weren't like saying, well, severe thunderstorm warning means, obviously you would know now, a tornado could form at any time without warning. Well, this one did. It happened to be an F5. But back then they were like, and I think the mindset was, severe thunderstorm warning, that means wind, hail, not tornado. Of course, now today with the tags, they have tornado tags on severe thunderstorm warnings, especially if they think a tornado is going to develop, but it's not going to be maybe like a spin up, something like that. So I think there was a lot of issues that went on with that as it thunders outside again. I'm keep thinking it's going to do something outside. But so there was a lot of problems with that. The radar caught it and whatnot, but if they had had a lot of the stuff today, it would have been caught. It would have been warned on, tornado warned on, probably all the way back from Rockford when the first tornado warning went down, all the way through. And they did eventually issue a tornado warning. Unfortunately, the tornado had already lifted past Crest Hill at the time, east of Joliet, and it was already gone. So, and that was the case with most tornado warnings, especially anomalous ones, not like Heston or like the tornadoes of the late 80s, early 90s, where it's like, oh, we see the tornado, boom, tornado warning. It's not like that. It's almost like they issue it after the fact back then, some of the time, but not all the time.
Yeah, the radar is not going to pick it up too much. I've seen hook echoes go over Chicago before, and Chicago Weather Service, they kind of hold steady because they know it's not producing a tornado. You can say, oh, there's a big hook echo right over Chicago, but they know the storm is elevated. So just looking at the reflectivity, it's anyone's guess about what it's doing at the time. The other thing is, no one could see that tornado. You mentioned that you had just finally seen a picture of that F4 that passed 10 miles from your house just this year. To date, there is no known footage or photos of the Plainfield tornado. Yeah. So, which is amazing too, that, we had this F5, it's not warned, there's no pictures of it. And so it almost becomes this mythical beast. We're talking, and you start throwing out these astronomical numbers like 8,000 K. And I've been to lectures where they're talking, well, if you tweak the numbers or look at this, it was actually 12,000 K. So it starts, the tails start to grow, and you start getting this mythical beast out of this event. It becomes legendary almost. It's kind of like the 1925 tri-state tornado, which is another legendary mythical beast. And so yeah, it's just that sometimes these freaks of nature occur, but fortunately we're so much better prepared for that. Plainfield has a little army of storm spotters now. That's one of the most diligent, well-prepared areas for tornado disaster response. Now there's multiple spotter groups, there's emergency management and disaster recovery. All the police and fire are very active about storm spotting there. Yeah. The tornadoes, they don't sneak by over there now. All the little ones get noticed and reported, and so that's great.
Like the ones we had a week or so ago near Pontiac, that little tiny little ones that spun up, even though it's further south. But because you have to prepare. Most people up here think, well, it's August now, tornado season's over, and then you have Plainfield. We had We have outbreaks in October that you chased in Western Iowa. The Wayne, Nebraska tornado was the same day.
Yeah.
It's becoming that tornado season, these anomalous events, you're starting to get more of these, and you're starting to think, okay, have they always been around? Have there always been major tornadoes in August? Because August, you don't think of major tornadoes because it's the only F5 in August anywhere in the country.
Right.
So it's, when you look at all, if we went through all the F5 or EF5s as they are known as now, you look through all the months, they're pretty much all in the spring, except for a few outliers. Plainfield's one. There was one in October in Iowa, and there's I think one or two in the South somewhere.
Yeah.
They're very anomalous, but these events, they've been there. It's similar to stuff has been there like way back when they say, well, there was only like 800 tornadoes in 1970. Well, back then there probably was 1,200, but you didn't see 400 of them. They make it sound like, well, there's more tornadoes now. That's because there's more people seeing them now. Similar to, let's say, Plainfield. Plainfield back then in and around Chicago, there weren't very many spotters. As what is now the case today, there's tons. So, and you said, they're all going to see it. They're going to see every little satellite tornado. They're going to see the Rochelle Fairdale tornado. Like, of course, that one was humongous. But they're going to see that type stuff and the small little spin-ups more than way back when nobody was paying attention. There's no tornado watch, so nobody's looking for them. So,
yeah. So right. And you're definitely right about the frequency here. I don't think anything has really changed. Obviously, our climate is always in a state of change, but I don't think we can really say one way or the other how that's influencing these tornado numbers just quite yet. We really don't know too much about the history of tornadoes to really say how those numbers are being impacted by our current climate change. But we do know that these events are pretty rare. So, and we know they probably happened in the past. And there's been a couple since then. So we had the 1990 Plainfield F5, northwest flow, weak directional shear, extreme instability, it was in the 80s. And a derecho was expected. Then in July of 2004, we had very similar environment. We had dews approaching 80. We had extreme instability. We had northwest flow lock. We had weak directional shear. And the issued a 5% tornado for that event. So they're not expecting a big tornado event. I believe they actually went ahead and put out the tornado watch for that event. And that initial supercell formed in central Illinois and tracked southeast. And they put down a large F4 tornado. And that tornado was well warned for in advance. And then the storm complex from there blew up into a big derecho, a big damaging event. So very similar to Plainfield and how that evolved. And I think people kind of knew that potential was there this time. That event was handled well. The Parsons manufacturing plant took a direct hit.
Yeah.
They had a tornado shelter installed in that factory. Everyone was inside of it. The factory was completely destroyed. Nobody was injured. It was a big success story. So it was kind of like we got to do Plainfield over again, and this time we did it right. And we're kind of prepared for it now, I think. So these events happen maybe once every decade or 2 decades or so. So they're rare, but the potential's there. So just looking at the ingredients in the atmosphere, that combination of extreme instability, the lift that you get from that, and whatever shear is there. So that kind of setup doesn't happen too often, but we're ready for it now. Gerald, Texas, another F5 that was moving south. That is another semi-analogous event. So,
of course, that one was moving horribly slowly.
Yeah.
There was no steering current at all. It was just drifting, more or less.
Yeah, that storm was doing an unusual propagation along a boundary, and yeah, another really interesting, weird event to study. An amazing tornado, very visible. Plainfield, not visible at all. Roanoke was actually very visible. So even though these events are similar, the tornadoes themselves can vary quite substantially. So you look at Plainfield, no one could see that tornado at all. And it makes you wonder how many F5 potential capable tornadoes have there been where we just never knew they exist. We never knew they happened. So we get these big storms that kind of form, and even today, these tornadoes can be buried in the core of a storm. And if it tracks over an empty area, nobody would even know there was an F5 tornado in that storm. So it's not until it hits something or, people get killed. And especially back then or even earlier, I bet you there were a lot of violent tornadoes that we just had no idea they even happened.
Would that be similar to, say, the El Reno storm, which was classified as an EF5 and then downgraded because it didn't hit anything?
Yeah. So what made El Reno really exceptional was that it had radar measurement on it. And of course that, it killed people, and especially famous storm chasers. Had El Reno happened in the absence of that radar and the human impact, that would be not a memorable tornado at all. Nobody would be talking about it. Nobody would even know. You probably know there was a tornado, there was damage, and there was a damaged path. But it would not be a significant event. We'd be like, okay, we had an F2, F3 tornado or something happen here. And those happen all the time. And that would be about the end of it. And even if it hit maybe a less populated area, because we're pretty close to Oklahoma City there. If it was more out in the open, we might not even know it existed. So we might say, yeah, there was a big HP supercell here and there was some damaging wind, but it was probably just the RFD. So I had a big damaging RFD on the supercell, and and that's about it. And then nobody would think twice about it. So so we have these huge significant events, and we just don't even realize what's happening here until we have the tools and people there to kind of witness it.
Of course, now we have a lot more chasers. They chase anything now. And I'm sure I might go on a rant now, because I think it was a week ago, there was that big enhanced risk day. You know probably what I'm talking about, where they issued the 3 tornado watches.
Yeah.
From Minnesota, from the U.S.-Canadian border into north central Kansas.
Yeah.
Not one tornado warning. Barely any severe weather. Oh, I was so mad. I'm thinking they are crying wolf with this. I mean, the stuff was there. Models were indicating something was going to happen. It never happened. And that is so annoying, because I thought, the first thing I thought of is, if this same, and you know which storm I'm talking about, big, it was very dynamic, fairly dynamic for August, but I'm thinking it's August. The steering currents are terrible. We're not getting these big cold pushes that bring a lot of severe weather, especially April, May, June. It's August. The only thing you're getting is the dynamics. So of course, nothing happens. You get thunderstorm development, but it doesn't last. It tends to be these pulse thunderstorms that build up, rain themselves out. And that's pretty much what they did. You had a few severe thunderstorm warnings, and there was a few rotations, but they didn't last long, because the updrafts wouldn't stay together. They'd just fall apart. And it was so annoying. I'm thinking, are we tipping to the other side? But like before, 8,000 Cape, 10,000 Cape. We need to issue watches galore now, because if we were like Plainfield, we issue a severe thunderstorm watch, and then 20 tornadoes touch down and kill 50 people. And then we flip to the other end, issue a bunch of tornado watches, nothing touches down. Is that where are we tipping? Have we tipped in some cases on some events completely the wrong way, and we need to
I've seen several talks about the performance of the Weather Service and the Storm Prediction Center. They've improved quite a bit since the early decades. Their performance is getting better, but last week just goes to show you, to me it wasn't a huge error. To me, what that is most demonstrating is that we simply don't know whether or not there's going to be tornadoes and how significant they're going to be. We have a good idea of kind of the ingredients that go into it and what might happen, but there's too many variables, there's too many unknowns. The forecast diverges very quickly when you're talking about tornadoes, and we don't have the scale or resolution or the details to issue a foolproof tornado forecast. We're just not there yet with the technology and the science. So, and what you're seeing are forecasts that fail simply because we just don't know the entire workings of the atmosphere yet. So, and there's the 10%, you know, when you see a 10% bust, that kind of raises eyebrows. But, you know, I've seen 15 hatched bust. I've seen 30 hatched bust. And I remember there was the big high risk back in 2012, and SPC had a 45 hatched tornado up in Nebraska, and that busted. So the day itself featured a big tornado outbreak, but they had 45 hatched way up on the north end, and there were hardly any tornadoes there. There was one way out on the edge. So we just don't know yet, and these forecasts are going to bust. And this is, to me, most evident with these 5% days. Every year we get a whole mess of these 5% tornado outlook days. I don't know how many we get, 20, 30, 40. And some of them have huge, massive tornadoes or a lot of tornadoes. Yeah. Coleridge back in 2014, big violent tornado is only rated EF3, but probably because it didn't hit anything. If that hit town, we're probably at least EF4 on that one. And Bennington, that was an EF4, also 5%. Roselle, Kansas, I think that was, no, they went 10 on that day. Anyway, so these 5% days, we have so many of them every year, and they run the whole gamut on what happens with tornadoes. On lots of them, there's no tornadoes, nothing happens. You just have little weak pop-up showers. And then sometimes you get a big violent tornado. And so to me, the 5% is always this kind of unknown grab bag. It's just this what if, you never know what's gonna happen. Probabilities are low, but they're basically saying, at that point, they're basically saying a tornado could happen. We just don't know much more than that. So, and I think that's kind of the state we're at here with some of these events and days. And you mentioned chasers are on all of these events and they're on all of these storms. Yes, they are. They chase everything we see coming. And the problem with that is there's a lot of storms and there's a lot of events that we don't see coming. So the North Dakota oil field tornado is a great example. Gorgeous tornado, very photogenic. Only the oil field workers saw that tornado. No, there was no storm chaser up there. The event was not forecast at all. Had those oil field workers not been there, had the oil boom not happened in North Dakota, we probably wouldn't even know that tornado existed. So just this gorgeous white tornado tracking along the empty North Dakota prairies, and you know, nobody would have ever seen it except a few prairie dogs. So, and the other thing that happens is chasers like to pick the best target, the most obvious target where it's going to happen. So what happens is everybody winds up on the big storm, and then there's another couple of storms up over here where there's nobody, and those put down tornadoes, and nobody sees those. So that happens all the time, actually. So a lot of tornadoes slip by because everybody's on a different storm, or nobody could see it coming in time. So
now, when we go back to all these busts that happen, and they had I know Daryl Hersman at the IEM, the Iowa Environmental Mesonet, did a thing where you had all these tornado watches where there was no tornado warnings. And it seems like, from what I saw, that it's about, I think it was in the last 10 years, 20% of tornado watches have been issued in the last 10 years had no tornado warning in them. 20%. And of course, the lower, and he did it by month, which I'm like, January? It's like, I know there's tornado watches, but it's like, you're not going to get a very good data selection for, especially in the winter. But I noticed that it seems like the percentages really start to come up in late summer, August especially.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to wonder, is this a problem because Plainfield occurred and it was abnormal? And if something, let's say, and I mentioned this, I think, to a bunch of people that on our website, the staff we have, I'm thinking, if this same storm, the one I'm talking about, the 3 tornado watches, nothing happened, If that same storm had been there in April or May, we would have probably had tons of tornadoes because the atmosphere is different in April and May than in August. But I don't think that chasers are going to go chase whatever. And it's just frustrating that we warn people. The Weather Service goes crazy thinking something's going to happen, then nothing does. It's almost the cry wolf situation, and it might all lead back, and we're kind of leading it back to because of an abnormal situation that occurred in a suburban town in Illinois in August. You don't know when it could happen again because, like you said, it happens maybe every 10 years. Well, Roanoke was more than 10 years ago. So you don't know when it's going to happen again because it's going to happen again, but you don't know from what or what storm.
Yeah, so the violent August tornadoes are outliers, and I don't put any stock in the month. So as a storm chaser, what I like to do is I like to look at the setup and I like to look at the ingredients we have. And I don't care what month it is because there have been gorgeous tornadoes every month of the year. And it just so happens that those setups and ingredients come together less often in the summer and winter months, but they do still happen. So I don't look at and I would have chased last week if I could. I actually had stuff to do, so I couldn't chase. I would have been busting out there with everybody else. But I was spared a bust just because I had chores.
Well, they were all elevated anyway, because I saw pictures. They were elevated.
Yeah. So basically, if I see a good looking setup, I don't care what month it is because I know there have been beautiful big tornadoes every month of the year. And it just happens that those conditions come together when the jet's more active in the spring and the fall. So, but it happens in the summer and the winter too, just less often. So for example, the Wilkin County tornadoes up in Minnesota in 2010 was an August event. Gorgeous, absolutely some of the most photogenic tornadoes I've ever seen. And and not many people were expecting it. It's a 5% day, kind of weak boundaries. Just the ingredients were there, but nothing looked great. And lots of people blew it off. It's August. That's whatever. It's another Midwest low end event. And here are some of the most photogenic tornadoes that ever happened. So I think basically what it comes down to is we don't know, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of probability at work. So when you see a 10% forecast from the Storm Prediction Center, as forecasters and storm chasers, yeah, we're expecting tornadoes, like when you see that number come out. But if you think about it, we got a 10% here. This is an enhanced risk. It's not a higher end event. It's not a moderate. It's not a high. And 10% used to be a slight risk. So we're basically saying, yeah, the potential, there's some potential there. We're not expecting a huge event. We're not expecting a lot of tornadoes. And there's definitely a good chance that nothing's going to happen. And I don't know what the probabilities on the tornado watches were. But a lot of times on these events, I see very low probabilities. You'll look at the probabilities for tornadoes happening in the tornado watch. On a lot of these 5% days, they're really low. They're like 40% chance of a tornado, 20% chance of a significant tornado, or much lower than that. I think they even go to like a 30-10 or something like that. And what that means is there's only a 30% chance that a tornado is going to happen in the box. Yeah. And so they're expecting then that 3 of those tornado watches that they issue will have no tornadoes inside of them. So they're throwing the watch out just so people are ready in case it does happen. But the confidence and probability that it will is just so low that, they have no confidence or certainty that it's going to happen. So I think when they look at their numbers, they're going to take those probabilities into consideration, and they're going to say, yeah, we didn't have the confidence, and the probabilities were really low. It's just one of those things. Basically,
I do know from at least one of the tornado watches that the probabilities were not high, but they weren't low.
Okay,
but they were high for severe thunderstorms. But that didn't even hardly happen either in some places. But it's almost, it just drives people nuts, especially because, and I saw this for the first time because that's like myself and other people, especially chasers, are like, ooh, why isn't there storms? They should just cancel it. SPC screwed up. This was the first event where I actually saw TV people on Twitter complaining, bust, get rid of this watch already, because they wanted the watch canceled because nothing was happening. They were so upset. That was the first time in a while I'd actually seen TV meteorologists get so upset with SPC saying, just get rid of this watch, please. And the bad thing about it was, here in Iowa, I was never under the watch, thank God, because I would have really gone nuts, because we didn't hardly get any rain from it. But they kept the watch going in south central Iowa until expiration. And there was no severe weather for except for one warning for the last 3 hours. It was so annoying. Standing there looking at a radar going, is this storm going to do something? No. And I'm like looking at a radar. It's like so boring. And you have all these TV people that have to come into work because you never know when something's going to blow up and turn tornadic. And they're just sitting there twiddling their thumbs doing nothing. And then they get upset.
That's the reality of the situation. And I think people need to realize that we don't know what's going to happen. The potential, basically all the Storm Predictions Center is saying is the potential is there. We don't know what's going to happen. So you look at these ingredients. Okay, so we had a cold front coming in from the northwest. We had a kind of a dry line draped to the south there. We had an ejecting low. The low was deepening, and it was going off into Canada. We had another area of low pressure over Kansas there, and a nice little surface trough kind of nosing into southwest Iowa there. We had 1,500 to 3,000 K building in there, and all the convective models were blowing up that cold front there. So you look at this mix of ingredients, and you say, yeah, the potential is there. It could happen. And another day, you get the same thing. You get an ejecting low that's deepening. You get 70, 80 knots at 500 millibars coming in from a negatively tilted trough like we had last weekend, and that area of low pressure. And then boom, there's a whole bunch of tornadoes in southeast Nebraska, or northwest Iowa or something. And you say, well, why did it do it this day and not last Saturday? And that's what meteorologists are still trying to figure out. They're looking at these events in hindsight and saying, well, this one produced and this one didn't. Why? We've got the same numbers here, and that's the unknown that we're still dealing with. So to me, it's a little worrisome. It bothers, but it doesn't bother me that SPC has bust forecasts. I know they do, of course. But it bothers me to hear people complaining about it, because these really are the world's best, in my opinion, severe weather forecasters. And when people complain about it, it's like, well, they're doing their best. This is the best we have. So I don't know what you expect or want from them. Anybody else is going to do a worse job, in my opinion.
Oh, I probably would have gone crazy. I would have. The thing about it, and it just seems to be a problem because, and I've noticed this. It seems lately that, and this happened, and I started my SPC kind of pissiness many years ago, and we're coming up on that anniversary, unfortunately. April 13th, 2006. Which you're like, you don't remember that day because
I know 2006 was a pretty crappy year, so I'm assuming nothing happened that day.
No. April 13th, 2006. And I'll tell you this. This is what happened. Okay, it was in Iowa. You're going to immediately find out what it was. It was the Iowa City tornado. The one that hit the church, and the church pretty much got destroyed. And that was downtown. Okay. They issued a severe thunderstorm watch. There's this little cell that developed, just one little cell. It's at 5 o'clock, and I can remember it's like it was yesterday. And I went and bought my groceries. I went to Cedar Rapids and bought my groceries because I'm like, okay, there's storms coming. It was hot. We had record highs that day. It was in the mid 80s. and it was humid. So it was April, humid, hot. It was the first really hot, humid day. And here comes a frontal system. So of course something's going to happen. And you saw this storm. So I was like, okay, I can run and come back home and get stuff and be ahead of the storm. I came out of the store and I looked to the west and it was so pitch black. I had never seen it so pitch black. And I turned on the radio because of course this was 2006. And they said there were severe thunderstorm warnings 50 miles to my west. And the storm was 50 miles away and it was so pitch black and dark. And it was still, the sun was still out, but of course it was behind the clouds, so it was dark. And those storms, it was a big complex. It was almost like an MCS. What happened was you saw individual cells all in this complex, and every single one started rotating almost all at the same time, and almost every single one produced tornadoes. And there was so many tornado warnings. I remember watching the television when they were showing them. They couldn't stay on one storm long enough because they had to go to another one. And every single one produced a tornado. And it was so crazy, and they didn't issue a tornado watch for it. But we had 13 tornadoes that day, which in Iowa, it's like, well, Chaser's like, Iowa, tornadoes don't happen there. This is especially because Adam always hates Iowa for tornadoes. But we had tornadoes. Most of them were at night, so you could not see them. There were chasers on on some of those tornadoes, and there's video of it. But they didn't issue a severe thunderstorm watch. And then they issued another severe thunderstorm watch into Illinois. And then they finally issued a tornado watch, I think in eastern Illinois into Indiana, but by then all the tornadoes were gone. And I'm thinking, and there was some criticism about why did they issue a severe thunderstorm watch, which kind of leads me back to Plainfield, because they issued a severe thunderstorm watch because they went by the book. And honestly, I would have thought on that day on April 13th that they should have issued a severe thunderstorm watch, which they did, but I don't think they were prepared for every single storm starting to rotate all at once. And then the entire thing turns into a massive tornado outbreak because nobody was predicting that. So it was like Plainfield, except on a slightly, I wouldn't say a smaller scale. It was more widespread, but it was kind of on a mesoscale type event where it was kind of from Iowa into Illinois. And I don't think they were prepared for seeing every single storm starting to rotate. And those tornadoes, one person died. It wasn't the Iowa City tornado, it was another one. They got killed in a mobile home. And they were warned for. So all the warnings were timely. But it's almost like you're thinking, okay, why did SPC not issue a tornado watch? And this leads me back to Plainfield because I think if you go by the book, that day wasn't going to produce tornadoes, and it did anyway. And that's kind of where I was like, well, SPC messed up. But they mess up and they get stuff good. So I can't really blame them, but I kind of still do.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, it's just a matter of when I hear people say SPC screwed up, to me, a screw up or an error on their part would be if they did something that they should have done, they should have known better, basically. It's like SPC should have known better to do this or blah, blah, blah. Should they have? Following their experience in the protocols going into the event, should they have known better? The one thing that always gets me is I don't too often hear people griping going into the event. Oh, SPC, those guys, they don't know what they're doing. They're a bunch of idiots. They're screwed up. You don't hear that at 7 in the morning when they issue the day one outlook. People are like, oh, okay, 10% or 5% or whatever, 2%, okay? It's afterwards where everybody's like, oh, stupid SPC, right? So, and if there are TV Mets and chasers and guys on the internet who are second guessing SPC at 7 in the morning and they're right, then yeah, maybe there's something that they're doing wrong, but I don't think that happens very often, if at all. So to have kind of the amateur crowd besting SPC in the morning, yeah, I don't really see that. But the other problem is Where they might get SPC is this crowd, the TV crowd, the amateur internet crowd, they like to hype everything.
Yes.
There's way too many false positives if you let the internet forecasters kind of rule what's happening. They're going to look at the setup and be like, tornadoes everywhere. And SBC is going to be like, okay, we're issuing a 5% here, and we're going to put down a blue box. And then there are tornadoes everywhere, and that the internet Joes are like, oh, wow, we were right, SBC was wrong. But then you turn these guys loose on another 20 or 30 setups, and they're going to bust consistently, routinely, over and over and over again, because they're going to be issuing tornado forecasts that don't verify. They're going to have all of these false positives. So I think everybody remembers that big outbreak where it wasn't forecast, and you know, and then it made SPC look bad, or you know, you can remember that botched forecast that one time, but nobody. But then there's all those 20 or 30 other forecast events where the conditions were kind of similar, and then nothing did happen. Nobody remembers those days. You know, why would you? You know, the forecast was weak and it verified and nothing happened. You know, and everybody forgets about it and moves on. So there's just those exceptional events which are going to slip through the cracks just because we don't have all of the knowledge of what's happening in the atmosphere.
And then, of course, there's just certain days where you think it's going to be tornadoes, but it ends up being like an MCS or a derecho event. And a derecho, when you think about it, can be as nasty, if not worse, than a tornado because it's more widespread. Right. But they're like, well, it was not a tornado, so they busted. So, I mean, not everybody's going to be happy with what they do, no matter what. Right. And I can go back to another event that was earlier a couple weeks ago where there was no tornado threat in Iowa at all, and a tornado touched down. There was not even a watch area. I think there may have been. There was a few warnings, so there may have been a severe thunderstorm watch. Tornado developed. It moved. It went in a loop shape. It went south, southeast, and south. Then it turned and went northeast. It was the weirdest thing. Yeah. And you could see the storm. And nobody was chasing it because it's like there's no risk area. So they're like, there were so many pictures of it because I don't know how these people got there, but all of a sudden there's like 20 or 30 people like immediately on a tornado in the middle of nowhere. I don't know where these people came from, but the tornado was moving at like 5 miles per hour. It was like drifting in every direction. I'm thinking, where did these people come from? Unless they just drove here because the tornado was moving at like 5 or 10 miles an hour.
I ask myself that every time I chase Iowa. I'm going through I'm in the cornfields, and there's all of these cars and traffic and people. I'm like, where are all these people coming from? I think that's just Iowa in general. There's just people all over that state. It looks more rural than it is. There's a lot of population for the amount of cornfields that you got there. And yeah, there's always people driving around for no reason. Brindley, my chase partner, and I are always joking about that. It's like, where are these people going? What are they doing? You know, it's 2 o'clock on Wednesday, and there's a whole bunch of cars on this highway in the middle of nowhere. Where are you guys going? So, and not to bash Iowans, but you know, there's the acronym. Iowa stands for idiots out wandering around. So,
oh, I'm gonna find that.
So we're always kind of joking about that. Yeah, there's another guy. He's just meandering around out on the roads for no reason. We see that constantly when we're storm chasing. Like, where are these people going? What are they doing? And the other thing is when I hear a tornado going 5 miles an hour and it's kind of doing this dippity-doo, loopy-doopy track, it means there's probably no wind shear. So there's no winds aloft. So the tornado is just kind of meandering around. And yeah, in these days, you're not going to have a big tornado risk. So, and the other thing about Iowa that I noticed is Iowa, for whatever reason, I think it's got to be just its geographic location. It's not, it's in the Midwest. It's just past, the main part of the Great Plains where the dry line set up. So you're not getting the big, huge ejecting trough dry line setups that Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle always see. Iowa's just past there, so they're getting a little bit different setups, and they're getting hit by that northwest ring of fire, and they're more northerly. So they're just located in this geographic location where they're getting a different kind of setup than the rest of the plains in the Midwest. And I've noticed that Iowa tends to go tornado-wise when it's least suspected.
Yes.
For whatever reason. So it's a cold core event. So your dews are in the 50s, and people are like, the dews are really low. Nothing's going to happen. Boom, tornado outbreak. And then, there's no wind shear, but the lapse rates were really steep, and there were some boundaries at the surface. Boom, tornado outbreak. It's a northwest flow in the summertime. Well, it's northwest flow. It's August. It's July. But yeah, the evapotranspiration from the cornfields, and we've got extreme Cape here. Boom, tornadoes.
Yep.
So, and nobody sees those events coming. Whereas then, when we do look at Iowa, we see, okay, we've got a big trough coming in. We've got some big frontal boundaries here. The dry line's actually pushing in. Whatever. It's a cap bust, or it goes MCS.
Yeah.
Or, and I think what people are trying to do is they're expecting kind of more of the conventional plains play to happen, and
Yep.
it's not happening because it's been transported 200 to 300 miles east, where the ingredients are no longer overlapping in the same way. We have different capping now. The storms are going to initiate a different timing. The timing of the system is off. There's MCS play here that we wouldn't have gotten in the plains just because of the location here. Stuff formed overnight, whereas it wouldn't have where it's drier in the plains or on the mountains. So those all throw a wrench in kind of the conventional setups that happen. So chasers are looking for the obvious play, and it doesn't happen there, and then they miss all of the subtle stuff that does happen. So I think that's really what's happening in Iowa, and as a result, it gets this horrendous reputation with storm chasers. Like Iowa is just a bitch, and it is. I was 0 and 25 before I got my first Iowa tornado. So I think it is a tricky state to chase, just because the events that unfold there are not as conventional as people hope or expect.
Yeah, you dropped off, and that was because my internet decided to blink on me, but it's still going. So I'm fine now. But and I've seen several events. It seems like most of the time, and with that event, we had the one we talked about, the 3 tornado watches. All we were looking at, and we always look at this, it's like, okay, typically when they issue severe weather, it's like, okay, look, there's morning convection. Well, that screws that. So like morning convection, well, there won't be tornadoes now. And that always happens. Or, oh, this is an MCS. Oh, won't be tornadoes, or maybe 1 or 2. And it's like, but the one the one we're talking about, 3 tornado watches, no morning MCS, nothing, and nothing happened. And it's so annoying that stuff like this happens. But in Iowa, I think it's just because we're hard-nosed as to when are we going to get an actual tornado outbreak that actually looks like a tornado outbreak instead of these surprise events that we seem to always get.
Yeah. Mapleton was kind of a conventional play that I think a lot of people could get on. Mapleton and those events back in October of 2013 up in northwest Iowa. To me, that was a little bit more of a conventional play. In both of those cases, you had a deepening surface low and a nice little trough and a warm front draped across northern Iowa. And to me, that's a very classic conventional play. And it did pan out in the western part of the state, at least. There were some pretty violent tornadoes that went through northwest Iowa on both of those events. Mapleton was back in 2011.
Yeah.
And,
but now I want to switch because you were involved with Sean Casey this year.
Yeah.
So how the heck did he find out about you?
Chasers all kind of network with each other. We meet each other out in the field. We meet each other at events. And Brindley and I have been hanging out with the Caseys since 2011. And, we knew each other. We met up on storm chases. There was a legendary party where it was in Columbus, Nebraska, and it was a huge chase day. It was June 20th, 2011. It was a 10% day, but it went bonkers. There were tornadoes everywhere. Everybody got a tornado, I think. You just had to get on a storm, and you probably got one. We missed the best ones, so we were a little beat up about that. but we still saw, I think, like 3 tornadoes that day. So we did good. We just didn't have the spectacular career day that some people had, and some people did. And Sean Casey was one of the guys that did. They got this gorgeous tornado, big, nicely contrasted, stark, dark funnel cloud and clear air, basically, with a big brown debris cloud underneath it. And they were real close to it, got it crossing the road right in front of them. They're amazing shots. So we're jealous of that, and a bunch of gorgeous, gorgeous tornadoes that day. But what some people were most jealous of was the after event. So what happened was, after all of these storms, people started congregating in the nearest biggest town for dinner, and that was Columbus, Nebraska. We wound up at the Applebee's. I think we were the first ones there. Brinley and me, Adam Lucio was chasing with us that day, and John Williamson. And we started calling people. We said, hey, come over here and let's do dinner at the Applebee's in Columbus. And so we got a hold of Tony Lawback, and he said, yeah, we'll bring Twistex crew over. So the whole Twistex crew came in, Tim Samaras, Carl Young, Tony Lawback. And so those guys were all there. And then the TIV crew heard that we were all there, so they came in. So we had Sean Casey and all of their guys. And then this was also during the shooting of Storm Chasers. So, and we didn't know it at the time, of course, but this was actually the last episode ever of Storm Chasers. So this was the series finale, and it was a huge day. So everybody was in a party mood, and we had several other chasers come in and converge with us too. So we had all of these groups at the Applebee's, and there was the armored vehicles and all the Mesonets and all of Discovery Channel's TV crew. They were all there, and the parking lot was just a mess of Storm Chaser vehicles, and it turned into this huge party at the Applebee's. It got rowdy. People were doing karaoke. We filled up the whole place. And then afterwards, we stumbled across the street to the hotel parking lot. Sean Casey was shooting off fireworks in the parking lot, and you know, more partying and shenanigans. The police were called. And yeah, the police were so starstruck that, you know, these storm chasers from the show were here, that they were posing for pictures, and they said, well, you can't shoot fireworks off in town, but if you go out to this frog pond over here, you can do it. So we went over to the frog pond, and we continued the party over there. So anyways, it was this huge event. Everybody had an absolute blast, and it wound up being, you know, the pinnacle, the peak of the Storm Chasers series. You know, it was the last chase for that show, and everybody had a huge day. So just a really memorable event. So you know, a lot of people were met that day, and we hung out with a lot of people, and you know, and I've chased with Sean Casey previously. The past couple of years, we've done at least a couple of chases in the TIV with them, acting as navigator or forecaster, or, you know, on short impromptu trips, or out for a few days. But this season, actually, there were some changes in the crew. Marcus and Brandon, they were going off to start their own storm chasing tour. So they needed additional forecasters and navigators. And so we were kind of next in line, I think. And I just happened to be available because I don't have a full-time job right now. I'm just working on several side projects. So I was available and willing. So they brought me in as a forecaster navigator for the Doghouse, which is their support vehicle. So they wanted a chaser meteorologist in each of their vehicles. Justin Walker was their chaser navigator forecaster for TIV, and I was the one for the Doghouse. So, and the two of us would then come up with the day's forecast and kind of bounce ideas off of each other. But yeah, that's basically how we got hooked up with the Caseys, and why I was out chasing with them this year. He is shooting a new IMAX movie. It's going to cover different facets of severe weather, hurricanes and wildfires, and tornadoes is just going to be part of it. So, and that's what we were out doing this season, is we were getting shots for his latest IMAX movie.
So I would assume you're going to be going to look for hurricanes. Too bad it's an El Nino year and there aren't any. Yeah,
the El Nino is killing them right now. I'm looking at the forecast forum. I'm not too keen on tropical forecasting, but I can follow the model guidance and keep abreast of the latest updates. And basically that's basically what they need at this point, is, you know, they're out shooting other stuff and they can't keep tabs on what's happening down in the Gulf and the Atlantic. And I'm just kind of updating them on what's going on down there. But I won't be joining them for any hurricane chases. That's something I don't have any experience with. And to be honest, it's something that I've never really wanted to do too much. I mean, I might do it at some point, but hurricane chasing is a whole different ball game than tornado chasing, and it's something that doesn't appeal to me as much. It's it's sitting in rain and wind rather than being able to sit on the road and enjoy the storm and how gorgeous it looks. So hurricane does not look pretty. There's not amazing storm structure. I mean, unless you get in the eye of a really well-formed eye, then that's about it. But otherwise, it's just kind of experiencing the wind and the rain and the waves. And that's something I'm not a big fan of. So, I mean, if I wanted to do that, I would just sit in the core of a supercell. And I don't like doing that. So.
Yeah, because I noticed when I watched the video when you were in the doghouse, you said, don't do this. You pretty much said, don't do this, what we did, because in the doghouse, you have to pretty much go almost right to the tornado. Yeah. Whereas your typical chases, you're like far enough away because you do not want to be in the bear's cage. You don't want to be anywhere near where excitement can happen.
Right.
More or less.
So yeah, I tend to be very safety-minded, safety-conscious, and more so than you would expect for somebody who's driving armored vehicles into tornadoes. And so the problem here was that in the doghouse, we don't have the armor. We're not supposed to be in the tornado. But for the most part, we're tagging along right with the TIV. And we do have hail guards, so we are core punching. And because we're trying to get, we're trying to get probes into tornadoes, in addition to getting shots of tornadoes, we're engaging in very risky storm chasing maneuvers, something that I generally do not advocate. We knew the risks that we were taking. We're experienced chasers and meteorologists, and we have specially modified vehicles, and we know what we're getting into. And so we're cool taking those risks, but at the same time, everybody should be aware that what we are doing is incredibly dangerous. And people should know that and not attempt it themselves, especially if they don't have that knowledge, experience, or the tools needed to do that. But anyway, so actually the Plainfield storm kind of reminds me of our day in Texas where we got into trouble a little bit. And it was kind of the character theme of the year. We had a lot of northwest flow events this year where the cap wasn't there. There was no cap. And what happens is you have a lot of storms go up and they're often sloppy and then go up early. And to me, that's kind of what Plainfield kind of was. A lot of storms went up in a northwest flow environment. Plainfield fired early in the afternoon. I think that tornado happened around 3:30 in the afternoon, and the storm had been already going for a couple of hours. So it was an early storm. Same with the Roanoke tornado in '04, also an early event. So, and we saw that again this year, just because we didn't have the strong elevated mixed layer that usually gives us our cap that holds the storms down until later in the evening. So what happened was the storms went up quite early, and we had these northwest shear vectors for a lot of our events. And what happens then is our storms are moving to the southeast, and we get these weird mesocyclone propagation on this leading southeast edge of the storm. The new meso forms like way out on the southeast corner. That's not really expected. People aren't expecting that. I think that's what happened with Plainfield, actually. And we had that happen on this Texas day. So we were in Texas, central Texas, and this storm went up, and we got on it pretty early. And the first cycle did nothing. Big clear slot, big wall cloud, didn't get anything on it. And then we realized the new meso at wall cloud was forming well to our southeast, right on the rim of the storm, almost out where there's clear air. And like, wow, that's really weird. We're not really expecting that. But we realized, well, it's a northwest shear vector, and that's kind of what happens when you have this kind of orientation. Once we kind of got the pattern and we were able to kind of figure out what was going, we were able to chase this storm. We were kind of able to get into our groove and start actually chasing this storm, even though everything was kind of a little bit backwards than what we were used to. We were able to kind of learn the new pattern and get on for the ride. And what was happening was the storm would spin up a wall cloud and cycle, and then it would get very rain wrapped, and then it would do it again to the southeast. So now we're hopping from cycle to cycle here doing this, and we're coming in from the north. So we're constantly in the green core of this storm. And we're in the core, we're in the hail, and it's always cycling right in front of us, and then we're getting rain wrapped again, and we're trying to get out in front of it. And I normally would not be in this position on my own. I would be sitting way out to the south or to the east, watching this crappy looking HP supercell with no visibility. Probably would have not gotten a tornado this day if I were by myself, just because I wouldn't have been in that position. I wouldn't have been putting myself in the storm like that. But anyway, we're here to get the shot, and we've got armored vehicles, so we're in the storm. And we came out on the south edge of the storm one time, and I've gotten in trouble before being in the bear's cage and being under stuff, and so I always like to do what's called a stupid check. You know, I like to stop and I like to look around and say, what's going on here? Am I being stupid right now? And we came out from the green core of the storm, and there was, in front of us, there was this ragged gust front, all these little points underneath the storm. And I said, okay, stupid check. And I got out of the doghouse to feel the wind. And we had cool outflow at our position. The wind was out of the west. And so was outflow. And as I was expecting, we're under a gust front. And there's a tail cloud off to our north, though, which is okay. There's some inflow up there. I'm not thinking too much of that. And the radar scan had a circulation, had a little couplet to our north. And remember, this storm is moving south, so the couplet would be kind of coming our way, but the scan was old. So I'm kind of assuming it dissipated and or moved away already. So I'm not expecting a tornado here. I think we're safe. I think we're in the outflow dominant portion of the storm. We're under this gust front. I'm just going to wait for the storm to cycle and get our bearings and see where we need to go. And while we're sitting there kind of waiting for this to happen and getting our bearings, Brindley starts shouting, tornado, tornado, tornado. And I look up, and to our northeast, there is a little tiny debris cloud, a little spin up, churning away on a small lake. And I'm looking at it, and it's tiny. And I'm thinking, that is a gust-nado, because it's small and it's on the gust front. And it's on the lake, so I'm thinking, well, you know, it's just kicking up all the water spray. You know, if it were over land, we wouldn't even notice it was there, just because it's this little circulation. But there was something really odd about it, which I didn't think of at the time, and that was the motion of this vortex was into the storm, and very rapidly. That thing was hauling west, and I didn't think about that too much at the time, why this little vortex would be moving so fast into the west. And in hindsight, a gust-nado should be moving east. It should be going out with the outflow. It should be fanning away from the storm. This little vortex was going into the storm, and I realized it was the top north end of a larger tornado. And what we're seeing is a tiny little subvortex in this larger tornadic circulation. And Brinley correctly said, if that's coming our way, it's going to run us over. And it was coming our way. And at that point, it was basically too late to do anything. I had seen nothing around me that warranted us getting hit by a tornado, other than the fact that we were basically kind of in the bear's cage and under this gust front. And you should always be prepared for a potential tornado impact when you're in that position. But just looking around, I wasn't expecting it at the time. I thought, this is an outflow dominant portion of the storm. We're fine. But we're not. So, and it was coming this way. Big, huge plumes of spray started to come off the lake. And we got into the doghouse at that point, and we basically just rode it out right there because it was already starting to overtake us. And I'm still not thinking tornado at this point. I'm still thinking it's outflow. I'm just thinking we're getting a blast of RFD or something. And to be honest, when you're in a tornado, especially a rather weak or broad or sloppy tornado, there's no real difference between strong RFD and tornado. They look exactly the same when you're in the middle of it. So the doghouse started to rock. We started to get real gusty winds. Small plant debris started to hit the windows. And we were basically battening down the hatches at that point. We put on our helmets, we put on our goggles, and we were in it just in case the windows got blown out or something. And I'm still not thinking, you know, we're in the tornado. I'm thinking, but I am perplexed as to where all of this wind is coming from. And it's shifting directions too. We're getting a wind shift. It was out of our west initially, then it came out of the south, and then it's back out of the west, and now it's out of the north. And so shifting winds, really strong. What the hell is going on here? I don't know. Nothing around me warrants this amount of wind or activity. So I'm looking around, I'm scanning the horizon. I see gust front, I see crappy cloud structure. I don't see any structure that warrants tornadoes. And then finally, I rolled down the window and I just slowly looked straight up. Like I just tilted my head straight up. And sure enough, there was a giant bowl funnel just this giant hanging bowl right over our heads. And I'm like, there it is. That's where the wind's coming from, you know, and you just feel completely overwhelmed at that moment to have this giant bowl right on top of your head. Like, what, you feel so tiny and weak in that moment. And as I watched it, just kind of transfixed in the moment, I could already see it was already starting to move south of us. So we were out of the path at that point. It was already moving away. So, but basically we were in a weak tornado. The TIB measured 76-mile-an-hour winds, which is EF0. It's a very, very weak tornado. And I think that's why we didn't have all the warning signs. It's just, it was a weaker tornado that didn't present itself with very prominent structure. So, and that's what happens when you're under the storm in the bear's cage. You can get hit by tornadoes like that and not see them coming. So we were in a weak tornado, and we weren't supposed to be, because we're in the doghouse and we're not prepared like the TID is. So, so yeah, that was kind of our hairy moment, and a position that I would not normally find myself in, and something that I regret doing. I felt really bad about that. Brindley was really upset that we were in that tornado, and it's kind of my fault, because, you know, I was calling the shots and we shouldn't have been there. So I felt really bad afterwards about that. And but luckily we were okay, and it wasn't worse.
Now the first thing that comes to mind when you were talking about that is it sounds almost exactly like the Moore tornado from this year as well.
Yeah, yeah, similar in that it was kind of on the leading edge of the storm a little bit, and that it had a nice bowl funnel aloft with kind of a circulation underneath. Yeah, it was similar in that regards. Actually, quite a bit different meteorologically on how they formed. That Moore tornado is what I would call a mesovortex tornado. Basically, it's spinning up on the apex of a bowing portion of the gust front, and you get these little hook-like curlicues.
Yeah.
On that bowing part of the line. It was not. I don't think it was a supercellular tornado, and because of that, Norman wasn't really expecting a supercellular tornado there, so they had a severe thunderstorm warning out and not a tornado warning. And I think they were kind of right to do that. You know, like the storm did not look like it was going to put down a supercellular tornado right there, but it did produce a tornado. It was just not the classic kind.
It was another northwesterly type situation, moved northwest to southeast.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and I think that the motion on that was mainly because of the mesovortex type nature of that. It was on a bowing portion of the gust front, and the gust front typically does bow from northwest to southeast. So when you get a northwest, or when you get a mesovortex off of that RFD gust front, I think that's kind of what would happen. I think the storm motion that day was predominantly easterly, east northeast. So it's kind of conventional in that sense. There was a nice supercellular tornado up near Tulsa that day, which had a little bit more typical behavior to it than that other one down by Moore. So when we talk about these events, these northwesterly flows and the stuff like Plainfield, if something like that were to happen now, yeah,
and you saw it, would you, for one thing, depending on what SPC does on their outlook for any kind of event, would it be a day that could easily be a bust, big tornadoes, or a derecho or something? Could it be any of those things if something like that were to happen, let's say tomorrow, which of course
yes, yes, absolutely. All bets are off when you have that kind of environment, and it's happened a few times since then. We had an event this year where we had 80-degree dew points in central Illinois. We had northwest flow, and we had extreme instability, Cape 5,000-6,000 or higher. I think it was getting up to 7,000 there. We had a little bit of helicity even. So the SIG-TOR parameters were off the charts. We're seeing great big SIG tornado bullseyes in Illinois, and a lot of storm chasers came up for that. People remember Plainfield. People remember Roanoke. People have studied the case studies on those events. We now know that these can produce big violent tornadoes, and so we're now on the lookout for these events. So a lot of storm chasers came up from the plains to chase Illinois this July, and because we had a big extreme Cape northwest flow, weak directional shear event, and the potential was there for a violent tornado, and it didn't happen. So we had a really nice supercell go up near Ottawa, Illinois. Gorgeous structure, stacked plates, updraft tower. It cycled several times with nice wall clouds and big RFD clear slot cuts, nice little dramatic lowerings underneath, and it could never wrap itself up enough. I don't think it was never pulling in very strong inflow at the surface, and it wasn't kicking off too big of an RFD, or the RFD was overpowering whatever little inflow there was. So balance of thermodynamics and kinetics at the surface just wasn't there. So we didn't see the tornado, but the potential was there, and people are definitely looking out for it. But these events are big wild cards. I think a couple days every year we get dews in the 80s in Extreme Cape, and we get a little bit of wind shear with that. So these events are more common than people think. It's just when the conditions are right for that tornado to happen. So I think we're looking for this event every year, when the parameters are there a couple times each year, and it doesn't happen. It's a rare event, but we're on the lookout for when it does. And I'll chase those events and bust. I'll chase 10 of those events and bust until I do get the violent tornado, because I want to be there when it does happen. And you have to play them all. You have to take your busts and keep chasing, because you don't know what's going to happen. So you have to be there for when it does. And yeah, SPC was on top of that event. They had higher tornado. I think we had 10 hatched that day. There was a tornado watch out. So I don't think they ever tornado warned the storm though. It looked great on the radar. It had a nice hook echo, but the velocities just weren't there. So I think they kept it a severe thunderstorm warning, and rightly so, in a very volatile environment, and they kept it severe, and they were right to do that. So whereas I think every Joe Schmo on the internet would have been pulling the trigger on a tornado warning, and it would have busted. So
yeah, because it leads to, you don't want to issue tornado warnings just to issue them. Yeah.
And we're already 75% of tornado warnings already bust. So if you have a guy who's crying wolf, you're talking like 95% of these warnings are going to bust. So
now I'll ask this: are you still going to chase with Sean Casey next year?
I think they're done. I think they're wrapping up their shoot. So,
oh, you're all going to be depressed now.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, we said our goodbyes in June, and it was sad. A lot of guys are going off and they're doing their own things. So for some of the crew, that's going to be it for them. They're done storm chasing. So so it was sad to see a lot of these people go. And but Brindley and I are going to be out there next season. There's a chance that we're actually going to be involved with a research project. So that's cool. You know, that's still being developed and it's in the works, and we don't know the details yet. So it's a big if, but that would be really cool if it happens. Brindley and I are going to be out there regardless, but there's a good chance we're going to be doing some actual research next season, which will be really cool.
Is that what you want to do instead of just going out there and chasing things just to chase them?
Yeah, you know, I'm eager to do stuff like Chase with the Tib and Sean Casey and research projects, because it's great experience. I love doing something new. I love meeting new people. I like doing something valuable. You know, I like making a difference and being a part of a project. And, you know, I love storm chasing, and that's why I do it. If I get to apply my love and passion to you know, something where it's useful, that's awesome. I'm totally on board for that, you know, and when it happens, you know, we get to chase and even make a little money. Not only are our expenses covered, but, you know, it becomes our job even. So, and it very much was a job this last season. So we were out there to get IMAX footage. We're not out there just for the fun of storm chasing. So it got a little, you know, it became a job at some point, you know, and not just fun. So, but yeah, I'm always happy to do that. I'm always happy to be out there doing something useful. And if it's going to cover our chase expenses, great. I'm totally on board for it. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask this, and then I'll try to get you out of here because it's after 9 o'clock now. With this, with us having an El Nino now, we're in the middle of what they're calling Godzilla El Nino. I'm sure you already hate that, but El Nino, What do you expect for tornadoes next year, as we're probably going to be getting out of this El Nino next year?
I was talking to a meteorologist who knows a lot more about this than I do, John Allen. He's from Australia. He's up in New York State right now. He's actually involved with the research that we're doing on the El Reno storm. And Anton Simon, who I forgot to mention. These are the guys I'm working with studying the El Reno storm currently. We're still wrapping up our research for that project. Anton actually did a really interesting paper on the Plainfield storm. It's kind of this coincidence. Plainfield is what got me into storm chasing. It tracked about 5 miles from my childhood home at the time, and it's what lit the spark. And Anton, who I'm now working with on El Reno, he did a really neat case study on Plainfield where that storm actually did a polarity switch. It was all positive lightning strikes as it formed, and then like that, it flipped negative and the F5 formed. So something really interesting happened in that storm where the formation of a violent tornado coincided with a polarity switch in the lightning. And so really, really interesting work. But anyways, John Allen, who's also working with us on our research project, he follows these trends much more than I do. And Anton also does a lot of climate work. But John Allen was basically telling me the other day that the changing ENSO pattern that we're in here right now, next season he's expecting maybe a little bit quieter, more of a capped early spring. We might be fighting a more capped, or we might not have the cape materialize. And he thinks it's going to be a little bit later season. It's going to be a little bit more northern plains. So, and that's just a rough guess looking at the kind of the pattern and the climatology. So, which is great. I love late season northern plains. That's my favorite time and place to chase. So if that happens, great. But here's the other thing. As a storm chaser, I don't give a damn about climatology or El Nino or any of that. I don't put any stock in it at all. And I know it affects my storm chasing, and I know it has impacts on how many tornadoes we see. But here's the thing. There are big, gorgeous tornadoes every year, regardless of the pattern, without fail. Every single year they happen, and you just got to be there for when they do. And whether it's El Nino, whether it's La Nina, whether it's northwest flow or southwest flow, or it's got no cap, or whatever's happening, the big picture, there's still going to be very pretty tornadoes somewhere. And there were a whole bunch this year. So Colorado had several very, very photogenic days. There are a couple days with big tornadoes. The Rochelle tornado in Illinois, Oklahoma got a big one. There were tornadoes, and it was a crappy El Nino year. The overall tornado count is down. We had 0 high risks this year.
The year's not over yet.
Yeah, that's true. And because you get those big fall high risks sometimes. Those big
actually in El Nino years, because I went on this, that El Nino years, especially in the Midwest, be prepared for about anything from a blizzard to tornadoes, because it could be about anything.
Yeah.
At this point.
So a lot of people like to speculate. A lot of people like to look into that long range stuff. I don't at all. Well, regardless of what the big picture, what the overall pattern is doing, that the ingredients come together at some point, and then I'm just there for when that happens. So there'll be pretty tornadoes in a La Nina. There'll be pretty tornadoes in an El Nino. So, yeah, that's basically where I stand on that.
Yeah. So he pretty much says there'll be a tornado, but he just doesn't know where.
And that's the best anyone can do. So anyone that tells you otherwise is kidding themselves.
All I'm open for, I want to see a tornado. Problem is, I'm like one of those crazy people. It's like, I want to see a tornado. I want to see it in the middle of a field, nowhere near anybody.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. It doesn't. It just big, nice cone tornado sits down and then it goes back up, and then I'm like, okay, I don't need to see another one.
That's exactly what I want too. And we had that this year. May 9th in Colorado. It was what Brinley and I called the dream chase. And
yeah, I saw the video of it.
Yeah. And those tornadoes were nice, big, photogenic tornadoes, and they were all EF0 because they tracked over open land and hit nothing. So just perfect day. Big, nice, big tornadoes. Very, very pretty. Doesn't hit anything. All EF0s. So, the ultimate catch is a violent EF0. So that's my dream catch. Is something like an EF0 wedge. So
An EF0 wedge.
yeah, and it's happened before, and it can happen. So it's just a matter of that tornado staying over the field. So,
and I'm sorry because now you got me on this. There was one tornado. It was on the April 13th, 2006 event.
yeah.
It was an F1 tornado. It was a half-mile wide.
Yep.
And it actually hit some houses, but it was so big, it just wasn't spinning that much. It was
Right.
big. It just took some roof, and I'm thinking that was wider than all the other tornadoes that outbreak, but it was one of the weaker ones because it didn't do a lot of damage. And it kind of irritates me, and I think it probably does you too. When you see people, they look at a tornado and they start specifying what strength it is from looking at it.
Right. That's kind of common. You have kind of a big, sloppy tornado. To be honest, El Reno was a little bit that way. There were violent subvortices inside of that tornado, but the 2.6 mile wide circulation itself was kind of EF0, EF1-ish. So the big part of that tornado was pretty weak. There were violent portions inside of it, and that's pretty common. And I think you'll actually find that a lot of these big HV supercells, they have what you could technically call a mile to 2 mile wide EF1, EF0 tornado inside of them, because that whole ball portion at the bottom of the hook is technically rotating in a closed loop with with wind speeds approaching tornadic levels. And so you get kind of this big sloppy circulation at the ground level. If you want to call that a tornado, it technically is. And I think that's fairly common. And so what happens actually is as that circulation gets tightened into a more compact form, that rotational energy actually increases. Like the old adage, the old analogy of the ice skater pulling her arms in, that increases the rotation of her spin. You have those little tight drill bit tornadoes. They're often much more violent than the big sloppy tornadoes, just because all of that power and energy is concentrated in that little tiny space. So yeah, you can't judge a book by its cover, and not especially with tornadoes. And but there are some visual indicators. If you see a big clear air wedge that's really got violent motion to it, you can basically assume that that tornado is capable of doing violent damage. If you start seeing all of the little horizontal secondary vortices coming off the tornado, what I like to call vorticity noodles, the tornado is almost always violent when you see that. Yep. That's a good indication that you've got a violent tornado. So when I see a big, clean, nice looking wedge that's violently rotating, or all of those secondary vortices coming off of it, I'm comfortable calling it a violent tornado. I'm not going to guess what EF rating it's going to be, because that just depends on what it's going to hit. But I've seen several tornadoes that I've said, yep, that's a violent tornado. And then when it's rated EF3 or EF2, it doesn't matter. It clearly was violent. It's just a matter of what it hit or didn't hit.
So we'll do our shout outs, and you pretty much shouted out a bunch of people at this point. And I assume you probably want to shout out this. Yeah, I almost want to know more about this Applebee's party at this rate, but
yeah, it's on my webpage if you want to check it out. We've got a whole bunch of pictures. Brindley shot the whole shenanigans. Actually, most of the photos from my chase log that day were of the party rather than the storm chase. So, but yeah, if you go on my website, it's skip.cc. It's my June 20th, 2011 chase log. You can read all about it. So
yeah, we wanted
some gory details of the party, but there's a whole bunch of pictures from it on there.
Yeah, we want video. There should have been video of that.
Someone shot video. I don't know who has it. Sean
I don't think somebody wants to see it unless they want to blackmail somebody.
Nah, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, watch a video of all these people being drunk.
Yeah. Well, most of us don't care.
Yeah, we're not sure.
We're party animals.
If anybody wants to get a hold of you to find out about the shenanigans, how can they?
So yeah, you go to my website, skip.cc, and all of my contact information is right on there. So
Or I can just tell you, because I have his email. So.
yeah, it's skip.talbot@gmail.com is my email. And yeah, if you want my Facebook page or my YouTube page or my Twitter, again, that's all on my website.
Yeah,
So.
and what his YouTube stuff is actually good. And the funny thing about it is about the stuff about how you look for tornadoes and stuff. I went back, and I don't know if you've done this, go back to old tornado videos and look for the same things.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure.
I don't know if you should do that as another thing. Take that video that you made and use it for old videos going back into the 80s and 70s and start doing it.
Oh, yeah. It's all really... I do that every time I watch old tornado videos. Oh, wow, look at that nice RFD clear slot, and look at these little vortices forming here, and look what's happening up here. And at the time, a lot of that terminology wasn't there. So,
Now I ask. This will be the last thing, I swear, about the Ghost Train show.
Yeah.
Start talking about that for a little bit.
Oh yeah, the Ghost Train. Marcus Diaz runs the Ghost Train, and he's a great guy, really nice guy, chaser out of Amarillo, Texas, and it just became a kind of a talk shop type podcast for storm chasers, talking about the upcoming forecast events and what's kind of going on in the chaser world, and kind of the historical stuff too, just a hodgepodge of everything that's going on, and some of the controversy if there's any, and we try to get different guests on. And
oh, there's always controversy.
Oh yeah, there's always something happening in nerd world. So,
and I assume right now since it's not chase season, that's why it's not been done lately.
Yeah, everybody's off doing their own thing. It's the quiet time of the year, definitely. So. Yep.
So, well, we thank you, Skip, for being on, even though we talked about Plainfield for about 20 minutes and then talked about other stuff for like an hour.
Yeah, there's Plainfield's really interesting too. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff on that.
Just wait, because guess what the 25th anniversary for next year is?
Andover. Yeah, Andover.
Andover's 25-year anniversary. And that's the same day. No, wasn't the Red Rock, Oklahoma tornado in 91? I don't think it's the same day. It's in May. I know there was a lot of tornadoes in 91. I just remember that.
Yeah, it's a big year.
Yeah, unfortunately, 2016 probably won't be.
I'm not worried. I know we're gonna get a pretty tornado, and that's all I care about. So.
You better hope so. So, we do this show. Well, Skip does the Ghost Train show when he can, when Marcus allows him to, and he doesn't have all these audio problems like we did. I don't know how it fixed itself, but evidently, and while this was going on, I noticed that my modem has gone crazy and my phone is dead again. So everything's still working. I know we're still on because it says we are. So, but we do our show every Friday night, or we try to, at about 7 o'clock Central Time, even though right now it's 9:15 when we're doing this. So this is not the longest episode, unfortunately. The longest episode was 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, and that one went almost 3 hours.
Nice.
I do not want to be on a show for 3 hours, especially when it was a disastrous show anyway. So we thank Skip for being on, and he didn't eat anything like he did the last time.
I shoved my face just before the show, so you lucked out there.
Yeah, if anybody wants to, I posted Skip eating food from episode 23 when he was on last. It's on my Twitter account at IowaWX. So if you want to see Skip feeding his face like he did a year ago tomorrow, because you were on the last Friday in August last year.
Oh, neat.
So if you want to see that, go to my Twitter account. It's on there. Skip feeding his face. So anyway, but that's how you can get a hold of me on Twitter. My email is iowawx@gmail.com. You can on our Iowa Weather Network website that I am on with a bunch of other staff members. When Skip was on the last time, our staff was only 5 people, and today it's 13. We have chasers, and the chasers are not happy people because they're Iowa people, and Iowa chasers, they're not like Skip. They're like hard-nosed, and they're all angry and not happy. And they've gotten tornadoes this year. And I could go off on this one, and I'm sorry, I'm running off again. We had another event where there was not even I think we didn't even have a risk area again. And they issued a tornado watch for me. Now, and in eastern Iowa, and this one in Illinois. And there was a tornado warning. And I remember it because the Davenport radar was down that day. So Davenport had no radar. And here comes a tornado warning. They had to issue it based on our chaser seeing a wall cloud. 2 minutes later, they had to reissue, they had to do the warning again. They had to update it 2 minutes later saying it was on the ground because they saw it. So it was our chaser that works with us that actually was the one that told them that the tornado was there. And it was the only tornado in the entire state. It was an EF0 because it just went through a cornfield, but oh well. It added up our total. Iowa's had 29 tornadoes this year, which is below average. So, oh well. But I'm going to stop rattling now. So we thank everybody for watching. Hopefully everybody has a great weekend. We'll see who's going to be on next week because I'm fighting about 30 people trying to be on. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Skip. Skip can now go and eat something or talk to Brinley or whatever. So, so we're going to go. Goodbye. Have a great weekend.